Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Nathaniel Borick. I am a Outreach and Administrative Associate with the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia's Community Development and Regional Outreach Department. We're thrilled to have you all here today for the second Rural Community Action Assembly, Place-Based Partnerships for Capital and Regional Investment Strategies. I want to start by thanking our co-hosts. On the next slide, the Penn State's College of Agricultural Sciences, and in particular their Center for Economic and Community Development, and then the Center for Rural Pennsylvania. We're really thrilled to be partnering with them and thankful for their input in helping to select speakers and topics for this and helping to make sure that all of you are here participating today. So thanks to our co-hosts. Our agenda today will kick off with some welcoming remarks from Ted Alter from Penn State Center for Economic and Community Development. We'll have a panel on a topic for the day, place-based partnerships for capital and regional investment strategies from about 9:40 to roughly 10:40 a.m. Then we're going to break out into small group discussions with facilitators in each. And then we'll have about a 5-minute break after we do 25 minutes of discussion. And we'll come back for the second portion of our agenda on the next slide. From 11:10 to 11:55, we'll be having a resource chat with Cheryl Cook, Deputy Secretary for the Pennsylvania Department of Ag, Rick Valello with Deputy Sec with the DCED, and Jen Wakeman, Executive Director for Drive Economic Development Entity. And then we'll have closing remarks with Matt Leonard from Pennsylvania's Rural Electric Association. And we'll conclude at about noon. I'll remind you all, if you could please mute yourself, if you could please share your video and include your full name and organization within your Zoom name so that folks can see who you are and what organization you represent. And if you have any questions for the speakers, please submit them in the chat. If you are unable to mute yourself, you're recording today's session, and that recording will be available afterwards. But we'll exclude the small group breakouts. That portion will not be recorded. We'll be sharing an evaluation after the fact, so please fill that out and send it back to us. We appreciate your feedback. We have actually given more time to the small group breakout discussions for this assembly based on feedback from the first. And lastly, the information, analyses, and conclusions set forth here are those of the presenters, and they do not necessarily reflect the views of the Federal Reserve System. Again, thank you all for being here today. We're really thrilled to have you participate. And I am going to say thanks again to Ted Alter from Penn State and one of our co-hosts. Ted, thank you so much for being here, and thanks for giving these welcoming remarks.
Thank you very much, Nathaniel. Good morning, everybody. Great that you're here. Welcome to today's Rural Assembly. As Nathaniel noted, my name is Ted Alter. I'm co-director, along with my colleague, Professor Tim Kelsey, of Penn State Center for Economic and Community Development, the CECD, we call it. We're an applied research center. We're dedicated to strengthening local and regional development in Pennsylvania. And beyond that, we work with communities to address the issues that they're facing, economic development issues, economic impact issues, demographic change and its effects, government revenue and expenditure policy, capacity building, community capacity building, and social and economic inequality. Two of our colleagues you'll meet later, Alyssa Gerkles and Christy Schmidt. They will be moderating, facilitating a couple of the tabletop sessions, so you get a chance to meet them. That's our CECD core team. My colleagues and I, my CECD colleagues and I, we're really pleased to partner with our colleagues and friends at Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank and the Center for Rural Pennsylvania. sponsor not only this assembly, but also the entire series this fall. Nathaniel noted the topic for today's assembly, place-based partnerships for capital and regional investment strategies. Our goal overall for our discussion today is to provide practical insights, actionable strategies, approaches, models that can be put to use immediately. That is approaches that promote strong and equitable recovery in light of the pandemic that we have been experiencing. But I think the suggestions that are going to emerge will go beyond that matter as well and be important for community and economic development in rural settings, regardless of the situation. We have an outstanding lineup of knowledgeable and experienced panelists. They're going to share their insights and perspectives grounded in their various varied experiences. And I'm sure that they'll provoke our thinking. We are anticipating informative, useful, and as I said, provocative discussion that will help us deal with the challenges we're facing, and also, very importantly, to strengthen the networks and partnerships associated with this critical issue, the topic of today's assembly. At the first assembly, I don't know how many of you were involved at the first assembly several weeks ago, but I was struck by something in Teresa Singleton's welcoming comments. Dr. Singleton is the Senior Vice President of the Community and Regional Outreach Office at the Federal Reserve Bank, and she framed that discussion this way, just put very simply: place matters, people matter, policy matters, and partnerships matter. And I suggest to you that this 4 Ps framing, while seemingly simple, is actually makes a very profound statement about economic and community development, and is very very pertinent to the issues the issue that we are discussing today. Let me just say a couple of words about this, without a lot of detail, a lot of nuance. Okay, traditional economic development thinking places primary emphasis on generating jobs as the catalyst for growth and development. The idea that people tend to follow jobs. The evidence in recent years, including the on-the-ground experience of many of us working on these issues, these community and regional development issues, is that jobs tend to follow people, and people are attracted to place, locales that are perceived to provide quality of life experience for individuals of all ages and their families and their friends. The story is more complicated than this simple description, but the fact of the matter is that jobs, people, and places are all important considerations, and they are interdependent with each other. Ask yourself, what does it take to support development of people, places, and jobs? It takes working together. It takes communication, collaboration. It takes partnerships. It takes partnerships. Dr. Singleton's 4th P. Partnerships locally, partnerships regionally, and statewide, involving public and private sectors. And I would also emphasize non-governmental and not-for-profit organizations that are central to the functioning and quality of life in our communities. We need public policies that, this is my view, we need public policies that help incentivize this partnering work at all levels and all scales in support of people, places, and jobs. And I think we'll see these dimensions, all of these dimensions emerge today: people, place, policy, and partnerships. At any rate, I want to again welcome you to today's assembly. Thank you for being with us. We hope you have a very productive and valuable experience that supports your work, your community, your organization, and just again, the development of partnerships. And with that, I'll hand the program off to Dr. Ali Schott, who's a Community Engagement Associate from the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank. Thank you, folks, and I hope you have a great session.
Great, thank you, Ted. And good morning, everyone, and thank you to Nathaniel and Ted for their opening remarks. As Ted mentioned, I am a Community Engagement Associate at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and I am thrilled to be here today moderating this panel. Just as a quick reminder for those of you joining us, if you could just update your name and organization on Zoom, it will help us know who's here today and you could be part of the conversation. As a reminder, you can update your name by clicking on participants, right-clicking on your name and hitting rename. And if you have any tech issues throughout the session, please message Bon Kramer directly through the chat. So as I mentioned, I'm thrilled to be here and moderating this panel and to introduce our panel speakers who are going to share their expertise and perspectives on capital and regional investment strategies. First, we'll hear from Deb Markley, Senior Vice President at Locus Impact Investing. Deb will share with us the role of community foundations and place-based entities, as well as regional investment strategies and the role of funder networks and other partnerships in capital attraction and absorption. We'll then turn it over to Jen Giovati, President of Claude Worthington Benedum Foundation, which works with trail and river towns and college towns in southwestern Pennsylvania and West Virginia. Jen will be discussing the impacts of COVID-19 on rural communities and the need for scaled CDFIs and funder networks. And lastly, we'll hear from Chris Jones, co-founder and managing partner of Blue Highway Capital, on the need for financial advisors and officers, equity investments, and affordable debt for rural businesses, as well as the impact of COVID-19 on these firms and their employees. And finally, Blue Highway's model for partnering with management teams and emphasizing the creation of quality jobs. After we hear from the panelists, I'll open it up for a discussion on capital and in regional investment strategies in rural communities. And I want to remind you and encourage you that you can drop questions in the chat feature throughout the presentation. If there are quick clarifying questions, I'll ask them of the panelists during the presentation, or otherwise we'll hold sort of discussion probing questions until the end. So please feel free to drop in questions as you think of them. And with that, I will turn it over to Deb to get us started.
Thanks so much, and thanks to the Fed and the other sponsors. I'm really excited to be here today. Locus Impact Investing is a national nonprofit. We partner with place-focused philanthropy all across the country. But although Locus is a national organization, my roots, depending upon where you are in the country, are firmly in rural communities and regions across the country. It's where I've done the bulk of my work for a very long time. I want to start by sharing two things that we at Locus believe. First, we believe that communities should be places where economies work for all, and that capital is a tool that can drive inclusive and equitable prosperity. And the second is that we believe that philanthropy has a stronger role to play in making that happen, especially community philanthropy. So with that as some context about Locus, I want to just share several observations from the work we've been doing across the country, both pre-pandemic and during the last several months. So next slide, please. So it's not, won't be a surprise to anybody on the Zoom call here today that we have been, continue to be in the midst of a pretty unprecedented set of crises, plural, that impact all aspects of the development ecosystem. We have families and individuals who are in crisis. We have businesses that are struggling, and entire communities, the place itself, decimated as they lose business and even people over the course of this pandemic. Next slide, please. What we see that doing is really the crisis calling to community philanthropy, in particular, community foundations, to play a stronger role in the economy. And most community foundations are much more comfortable playing in the community development space. It's where their grant making is primarily focused. But as we've talked with our community foundation partners across the country, very early on in this pandemic and in the crisis, they started asking the question, how do we help small business? How do we get more engaged in the economy as they started to see their main streets threatened? Next slide. What that means is that foundations are being pulled to lead from the middle of the ecosystem in a way, to begin to work in economic development in ways that they have not done in the past and form new partnerships in the process. And we believe that community foundations are in a pretty unique place to step into this role, partly because many of them have a mission that includes inclusive prosperity, so they can center equity in the conversations about economic and regional development. They bring a longer term perspective. Most community foundations speak about the fact that they're here for good for always. And they also have a broader toolkit than a lot of other economic development and development organizations have. And so I want to speak a little bit and give a few examples of those. So I am done with my slides if you'd like to take them down. In spite of the community foundations being, we think, really well aligned to play this role, the traditional model of philanthropy creates a challenge for them. The model of let's invest our endowment and use to get financial return and use just 5% of our grant making to drive impact. And what we're seeing with community foundations in this crisis is more of them asking. Some of them have accelerated their asking because of the crisis. Others were doing it before. How do we use our endowments? How do we begin to invest more of our assets to achieve the kind of community change that we want to see? So I want to give you 3 examples from the community foundation world that are all relatively recent examples of them taking these steps in economic development. I won't go into a lot of detail. I just want to give you a sense of the scope. So one of the community foundations that we're working with in Kansas recently made a loan to a local ISP, internet service provider. They're in a relatively rural county, and parts of the rural county did not have access to broadband, and they recognized the inequity of that situation in a time when remote school and work is essential. And so they made a loan to that ISP with some other partners. In a few months, getting them active in extending broadband, a process that had they waited for federal dollars to come, could have actually taken years. So they stepped into this gap with their partners to make sure that rural places had broadband during this time. A second example from Minnesota, Community Foundation there has had a childcare lending program. Their approach to dealing with a crisis in childcare in terms of the number of slots has been to begin to lend to childcare providers to improve both access, number of slots, as well as quality and certification. They started to see how their childcare providers were being negatively impacted by the pandemic and began to launch a grant program to help shore up. They'd done a lot to preserve these slots. They weren't going to let the pandemic negatively impact them. And so this is such a good example of community foundations, not just coming with loan capital, but being able to make a really catalytic grant to make sure that these entities survive. And the final example I'll use is a rural foundation in Michigan that has been recognized the lack of payroll protection program loans in their small main streets and downtown areas. And so they started doing $10,000 loans to small businesses in downtown to help them get through the crisis, to pay the rent, pay utilities, pay their employees during the pandemic. That foundation is now in the process of approving a carve out of their endowment because they recognize those $10,000 loans were response loans. The rebuilding loans are going to be bigger. And so they're in the process of making that decision. One of the common features of all of these examples, to Ted's point, partnerships. Not one of these loans was done in isolation or without partners, whether it was a bank or a community development financial institution. This is not a job for philanthropy alone, and those community foundations are stepping into this firmly with their partners. We're also seeing, I think, a burgeoning of funder collaboratives that are either driven by a common desired outcome. There's a spate of affordable housing partnerships, grant programs, and loan programs that are being done. The Seattle Foundation has launched one. Other times foundations are coming together because they recognize that the need is just much greater than a single foundation could ever provide. We've seen that in Richmond with lending to small businesses owned by people of color. And you've seen a number of foundations and philanthropy coming together. And then they're coming together just to share the risk. And that is part of the model behind the Community Investment Guarantee Pool that Locus has been working on. I want to just say something from a regional perspective, because these are all very community focused examples. These are community foundations in many cases working in single counties or multi-county regions. But this crisis in particular, I think, has elevated the stakes for rural communities not to try to go it alone and to really to be thinking about the regional approaches. A lot of the challenges we're seeing in rural communities are common, and the ability to amass resources at the regional level to try to address them is just much more important. On our website is some research that the Locus team did with Brian Dabson on regional solutions to rural-urban challenges that looked at regional collaborations. Jen is going to talk specifically about a funder collaborative. We've done some work in Texas with the Texas Rural Funders where they were coming together to address these needs. But I just want to share 5 things that came out of the research that we did that I just think are good things to have in mind as we continue the conversation this morning. Each one of these collaborations had some challenges, but they did better and more than they could on their own. But they did it because they had a trusted, deeply rooted regional intermediary that was kind of holding the collaboration. And I really do believe that that can be a community foundation, and we are seeing that in some places. They also recognize that everybody within the region, rural and urban, had to value and understand the contribution that they made to regional prosperity. Otherwise, you had this constant tension between rural and urban. It's really important to address inequalities of all kinds. We are spending a lot of time talking about racial inequalities, but when you go into a rural community that may look pretty homogeneous from a racial standpoint, there's a lot of other inequities that exist: power dynamics, class issues, whether your family was from here or not. Those kinds of inequities and access issues are important to address in a collaboration. Final 2 goes back to that graphic, that we have to recognize that this isn't just about economic development and job creation. It's about community development, economic development, and the place. And if we're not seeing that whole system and how those pieces fit together, it's going to be really hard to develop regional solutions and collaborations that really make a difference. And the final thing, and again, this speaks to the value of community philanthropy, we've got to invest for the long term. This is hard work. It takes a long time. The pandemic is going to be with us in its immediacy for a while. The rebuilding is going to be with us for a very long time. And these collaborations need to have that longer term perspective. So I'll stop. I'm anxious to hear what our other panelists say, and happy to take questions as we go forward.
Great, thank you so much, Deb. And thanks for starting us off with your critically important insights on the current opportunities for community foundations, particularly leveraging larger systems through partnerships and moving out to that regional scale. We have one quick question that I'm just going to ask from the chat before we move to our next speaker. If you could just touch on briefly work that you or Locus Impact Investing have done in Pennsylvania. If there's an example you could share quickly.
Oh, let's see. We have actually not done a lot of work in Pennsylvania. Would welcome that opportunity. We did a little bit of work around economic development with a colleague, Eric Pages, several years ago in the very early stages of Locus up in Wayne County, looking at their economic development efforts. But we haven't done a lot of work in Pennsylvania right now. Doing a good bit of work in Central Appalachia, in the region that part of the region that Jen covers, as well as in Kansas and Indiana in the heartland as well. So I apologize for not having a Pennsylvania example to share, but would welcome hearing more about the work that's happening.
Great, thank you. And that's a great transition to our next speaker. So with that, I will turn it over to Jen Giovanni.
Hello. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you so much for giving me the chance to participate in this presentation today. It's a real pleasure to see so many friendly faces from the Federal Reserve and from all the other partner organizations and the nonprofits across the state too. So thanks for hosting this event. Deb did a great tee up to how some of this works with a broad range of examples that Locus has been involved in, and I can attest to the rich work that Locus and Deb personally have done in this particular space in many states. So I hope that Pennsylvania can start to take advantage of some of this because their expertise has really grown over the years. But I'm here to give a real drill down look at what is a private foundation. What approach do we take when looking at capital and serving a rural community? We are a place-based funder. Benedum has been around for 75 years. We are a roughly $380 million asseted foundation, and we devote our grant making into 4 core areas: education, health, community and economic development, and the arts. So I'm going to talk a bit about that today and try to give you a real idea of how a foundation invests their capital into rural communities. So this is Benedum's region, if you can see the first slide here. And I'm just showing this because the 4 counties in Pennsylvania that we are concentrating our grant making in are really the southwestern corner of the state. So I'm going to talk most specifically about that and hope that the Pennsylvanians in the room can extrapolate into their own region. I grew up in central Pennsylvania outside of Carlisle, so I know that this example is also relevant to other parts of the state. But Benedum I think remains the largest private foundation investing in West Virginia. And I just put this slide up. This is not something we use in-house. I created it just for this presentation, only to build on what Deb said, which is essentially no rural community looks alike. If you take the state of Pennsylvania, the Northern Panhandle relates a lot to Pittsburgh. It's more industrial, it's the steel towns. But you move south into West Virginia, we've got the Eastern Panhandle where we take the Appalachian Mountain Range and the Mountain Highlands through this whole entire part of the state. This is a lot of federally owned land, high mountain peaks, and it's just a stunning part of the state. This is what is sort of a well-known part of West Virginia because it's the southern coal fields, and you hear those referred to as well. And this is something else that the Pennsylvanians may be able to take out of what I'm going to talk about today with foundation investment. And then we Mid-Ohio River Valley and what we call the north central part of West Virginia. There's a couple communities listed out here so that you can get oriented. This is our service footprint. When I pull this back up to Pennsylvania, though, to talk about some of the strategies that we've used in our community and economic development and education work, I just decided to give the example today that relates to our rivers and our trail towns. This is, in this part of Pennsylvania, you probably realize the economy here is also a lot of agriculture and fracking. There's lots of wells throughout this whole entire region. But it's also been where a lot of the towns have settled along the rivers, Youghiogheny, the Mon, the Ohio, and the Allegheny rivers. And as you go down towards West Virginia, you can relate to sort of the towns that are here. And one of the things that we've done at Benedum is look at these as a sort of a consortium concept where these towns really connect to one another strategically in economic ways. And we really see, we've invested in industrial heritage trails, in river towns as a sort of necklace of investment. And I just want to also point out, this is the Allegheny River. And some of our foundation partners in Pittsburgh, we've also tried to create larger mega strategies where I can tell you that the R.K. Mellon Foundation and the Hillman Foundation have also done a similar investment strategy through the Allegheny in this direction. We've put together pooled funds like the Strategic Investment Fund, and then many of you in Pennsylvania may have known about the Power of 32, which was taking 32 counties in this sort of broader region to work more collaboratively together. And this gets back to the people, place, policy, and partnerships that Dr. Alter brought up in his opening remarks. So this is one of the ways a foundation can start to take small economies and pull them into larger strategies and make decades-long investment to try to build a regional approach. And I was talking with my program officers yesterday, and you know, one of the things that they were pointing out of why this is such a good fit for philanthropy is because when they think about these small, tiny towns, no matter which of these teeny tiny dots you might pick out, they see these as organized places with churches and fire halls and small businesses and home-based workers and all of these things that make for really special communities. Again, back to what Professor Alter mentioned about place really matters, and people want to be in places where either their family history started or that they feel they get the access to what makes them happy in life, whether that be farming or outdoor recreation or what have you. So this is one of the ways a foundation can really make a difference and have decades-long strategies that help microeconomies build into larger strategic strategies. Oh, and the other thing about this too is another piece that's important for us. Oh, I'm too quick on my thing is too sensitive here, sorry. Golly, sorry about this. Let me try to get, oh, my thing is so sensitive, sorry. Okay, is that throughout this area as well are a lot of community college and college branches and small private independent colleges and universities. We also connect our community development work to the education piece, and that is sort of secondary education and job training. So this is how in a rural context, these things really get tightly knitted together when we think about our capital and where it flows. So the last slide I want to show here, oh, this is frustrating. Okay, the last slide I want to show is another bigger strategy that philanthropy has come together. And this is that partnership piece again that was brought up in the opening remarks. This map shows the Appalachian Regional Commission's region. And all of these counties are part of the federal designation for the ARC. Benedum, as I mentioned, has these 4 counties and then the state of West Virginia. But we have worked very closely with the ARC and the USDA and the EDA and all these other federal agencies because our small grantees and the partners that we are trying to support very regularly need matching dollars for that federal money. And they also sometimes just need a thought leader to help them develop some of the ideas that they are working on. They also sometimes need more data. And we try to provide assistance in those different ways. But 10 years ago, the Benedum Foundation, along with the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation and the Appalachian Regional Commission, decided to try to form a larger collaborative in parts of 6 states. So this is where you have Northern Appalachia, Southern Appalachia, and then Central Appalachia. And we took the Central Appalachian region, which is the Eastern Appalachian parts of Ohio, Kentucky, and Eastern Tennessee, and the Western Appalachian parts of Western North Carolina, Southwestern Virginia, and then the whole state of West Virginia, because West Virginia is the only state entirely in the Appalachian designation region. And we took 6 parts of a very systemically disadvantaged region that could not seem to move the needle on larger economic transition and see if we could align better thinking through all of the grant makers in this region, or as many that wanted to opt in. And this, when I say grant makers and investors, this includes private foundations, community foundations, government agencies like the USDA grants and the ARC grants. And we later also started to include CDFIs because while they're not grant makers, they're essential players as mission-driven investors because their missions align so closely with what we believe in. So 10 years later, this group has really developed a number of productive work groups. They've had spin-off initiatives that have come from this, and they've helped to drill down into better aligned flows of capital for agriculture, arts, health, many of these core working groups that the funders themselves identified as being relevant to enough of them that they wanted to start to co-invest as a strategic group. So this is just another thing that Deb teed up a bit to show how we have been a core player in the backbone organization of this, which this has turned out to just be a classic collective impact model. And the backbone organization called Rural Support Partners has been essential to keeping many of the work groups and all of the work advancing here. And I don't know if Nathaniel or somebody else can potentially list in the chat the website for the Appalachian Funders Network, but you can see the list of work groups and also the logic modeling behind aligning philanthropic dollars into strategic areas to create what we call a just transition in Appalachia. And just is really just part of how there's better shared wealth for the people of Appalachia as the economy shifts to a newer economy. So lastly, I'm just gonna, if I've got another minute or two, I'm just gonna wind out my comments with what Dr. Schott brought up in the beginning related to COVID. So as a foundation that has 75 years of history, lots of partners, lots of grantees, and lots of connections within this rural region, we've spent a lot of time thinking about what is the best use of our money during COVID and what's the best uptake of information for a foundation like ours in the data and the experience that's coming out of our communities during COVID. And at a very high level, I can tell you this. We are most concerned in our education portfolio about education learning loss in our rural communities, kids that don't have broadband, schools that are spread out, teachers that don't necessarily get the support they need. And in the state of West Virginia, I can tell you each county is being asked to develop their own sort of COVID strategy. That's really difficult. So we're concerned about learning loss and what that's going to do to communities and the economy long term. And we're investing in those ways through specific projects, but also pooled funds of money to support schools and people. The other thing we've been really concerned about is public health in rural communities. We know that in our rural areas, access to healthcare is a challenge, access to specialists is a challenge, and now with COVID, the ability to bill through telehealth has been a challenge. That's been a challenge across the board, but you can imagine for small clinics how difficult that is. We've been supporting not only strategies and the potential to draw down federal dollars into telehealth to bring rural communities along, but we've also invested in things like just PPE and the types of cleaning and equipment that's needed for our county health departments. We're also trying, West Virginia is one of the states that has the highest rates of vaccination, which is tremendous, but this is now dropping off with COVID. So we're also trying to patch together some of our other programs to make vaccination as easy as possible, which would also provide access in new ways if a vaccine comes out for COVID. And then lastly, with community development, an interesting aspect of COVID is we were very, very concerned that the PPP money was not flowing down into rural communities. That capital was not flowing or being absorbed at the same rates, which means we were going to lose more businesses, and we were also going to not be able to serve sole proprietors that often don't have a long-standing bank relationship and often don't have a lot of debt, which makes them a top client in some of the banks to process them quickly. Ironic, so we were working with CDFIs, putting some of our money into CDFIs to help provide that technical assistance and personal assistance and additional money to help small business. What we've actually been seeing now as we continue to collect data is that, and maybe you've seen this across the state of Pennsylvania as well, that there's actually been some sectors that are doing really well, and there are more business startups than we would have ever imagined. New businesses and new business registrations at the state level that we would have ever expected. And the Federal Reserve can probably either clarify or discredit my comments here, but I think some of this has to do with the fact that home values have remained strong, and people had the last 10 years of a strong economy have left people with equity in their homes to take out to start a business, and 401ks that have been strong to tap into. So we're seeing more unexpected startups than we would have normally. And I hope Chris Jones might be able to build on some of what she's seeing as the next speaker after me, as she talks about how Blue Highway has been investing in rural businesses. So thank you. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them at the end of our session here.
Great, thank you so much, Jen, and thank you for getting us thinking about how we knit together both communities and funders to build partnerships and leverage networks, as well as the unique challenges facing rural communities due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I also want to thank you for teeing up our last speaker, Chris Jones, and with that, I will turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Allie. Thank you, Nathaniel, Jen, Deb, and Ted. It's been great to work with you on putting this presentation together, an exciting topic. Blue Highway Growth Capital is an RBIC, a Rural Business Investment Corporation. We're licensed by the USDA. There are 5 funds that have been licensed to date that have received their certification from the USDA. And we are the only one in the Maine to Maryland corridor, bleeding into Ohio and Virginia. The others are in the Midwest, the Southwest, and so forth. So we're in this footprint. I'm in Philadelphia, but that's because we need to get to the blue highways, the old roads on the maps. The atlases were in blue, so there's the origin of our name. And my partner is in Biddeford, Maine. So we cover a lot of territory. We invest $2 to $5 million in companies with $5 million at least in revenues to $50 million on the top end. But essentially, we also watch companies that are younger and have a whole group of businesses that we nurture and network with over a long period of time, so that when they do reach our minimum criteria, we can fund them. And we can be quite generous in what 5 million is. It could be 12, the last month times 12, for instance. So in any case, the reason we formed this fund is because there is a very noticeable structural break, which has already been discussed pretty robustly from other funding sources. But in the private world, there's a structural break between the amount of debt and equity that's devoted to other parts of the country and what's devoted to rural businesses. So for instance, on the equity side, in 2019, 82%, you might want to go to the next slide, Nathaniel, sorry. Thank you. 82% of all venture capital equity investments occurred in California, Massachusetts, New York, and Texas. So 4 states. 1/2 went to California. And coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, 1/2 of the capital that was received also came from California. Excuse me. The amount of equity that is available from the Wall Street or from M&A firms is really not available. So on that side, on the debt side, which this slide speaks to, we can see this is a little bit dated. You probably can't see the dates, but nevertheless, it shows a trend that's still continuing, which is that the number of commercial banks in the United States is declining. The orangish line are banks that have a single office, which are primarily rural. Forgive me. I think Comcast knows I'm on. The second portion of the slide, the middle section, points out that the share of assets that's devoted to small business lending has also been declining, and this has only increased. And the third references a citation that you can visit, which is a 2017 Community Bank Research and Policy Conference report by the Federal Reserve State Banking Supervisors, and it demonstrates that 16% of an average of 16% of a bank's loan portfolio is dedicated to companies, and the rest is in real estate and commercial development. So very little of most community bank money is getting into companies. The vast majority is for residential and commercial loans. So we are one response to that. Deb and Jen are another, but we're a private fund. So we have, as investors, banks, we have farm credit banks, we have foundations and endowments like Jen's, and we have family offices. And this network, I'll allude to a little bit later, but it really enables us to provide not just capital, but other resource. Next slide, please. So what do we do in addition to generating returns for our investors? We look for quality job creation and shared prosperity. And I just put this up as an example of the way that we define a quality job. It's not just a living wage. It's also, is this a fair and engaging workplace? Are there opportunities for mentorship? And what other kind of wealth building activities or community building, community contributing activities is the business involved in? So we are working now with a company that's employing a lot of autistic, neurologically challenged people. So that we view as a very community-centric and important objective. We have a business that's engaged in transportation for non-emergency medical treatment, and they're active in policy formation. So we like their activist pursuit in that for reforming, providing more reimbursement and less fraud and waste in that industry. So those are some examples. Also, there are obviously we provide options or some equity and profit sharing for employees. That's a great, real obvious thing to do, but there are these other intangibles about what a quality job is and what shared prosperity is. We measure all these things in a survey that was created for us by Next Street, and they aggregate the data and we report it to our investors just like we report our financial performance of our funds. So we are dedicated to these specific attributes. Next slide, please. So again, I alluded to our network earlier. This is our investors, our foundations, our Rise of the Rest is another initiative from Steve Case that's getting involved in investing in rural communities. We're very connected to this ecosystem. And to Ted's point about the 4 Ps, I think we're really connecting all these same entities together through our fund, and we're small, but we're beginning. We're 50 million in size, but we feel like the next fund will be larger, and as we grow with time, hopefully this will be not. There's clearly not enough, so no matter how big we can be, it's never going to be enough to cater to the demand. I'd like to. You can take the slide down if you'd like, and I'll just speak briefly about an example of an investment that we made. Might be a good story to hear. So there's a company in Northwest Pennsylvania, population around 13,000, that makes carbon graphite electrodes. And those are the raw materials for generating high intensity heat for melting scrap into steel in arc mini mills. And so it's an environmentally helpful thing as well. And the company had been shut down and was in bankruptcy. The assets were held by, I believe, PNC Bank, and they had been over-levered. So it was a financial re-engineering that was the problem. It was not the plant manager or the people. There were 260 people that worked there, and there was no fault of their own that they were in this situation. I think it had been shut down about 18 months. And I was approached by a gentleman who wanted to restart the plant and thought we could buy it out of bankruptcy, which we did for, there were about 130 million of assets. We bought it for less than 10. So we started it from zero. So this is an example of how we deviate from the $5 to $50 million in revenue strategy. We can build exceptions into that. and we invested to support the reopening. We hired all the people in the community. We gave them stock options. We gave them benefit plans, retirement and healthcare. All of that was incorporated into the restart. And we really only brought in one outside person to help with the management. So it was really an employee effort. I think all but a handful of people came back, and in the first year went from 0 to 10.5 million in revenues and 2 million in profit, to 3 years later, 50 million in revenues with 10 million in profit. And just because our model is one where funds tend to last about 10 years, eventually we exited the investment and our investors did well, but the employees ended up doing very well when just because rural communities face these conundrums as well. They were ultimately sold, not forced to, but did, on the condition that the manufacturing facility could not leave that town. So it's still there today. And the employees who had all the options became relatively, well off, and were able to reinvest in their town. They started software companies. They started a craft brewery. The ripple effect was generated around the area, and it's a very vibrant community today. So I just thought that it's an illustration of how you can do well and do good at the same time. The other thing I guess to talk about, wanted to mention, is the COVID situation as we've been able to observe it. First of all, there was a lot of delay on our end. There was a lot of uncertainty about the impact of PPP, of extended unemployment, of the deferrals of bank covenants, and people didn't really, companies and management teams didn't know where they were going to land on the end. Where were we headed? Nobody knew, right? None of us knew at the time where it was headed. So there was a lot of delay of taking any action at all, unless it was out of extreme necessity. So they held back in terms of capital, in terms of expansion, in terms of certain initiatives, but they became creative, and this is where we've been excited about opportunities right now in the communities that we're looking at. Very exceptional management teams demonstrate to you that they know what to do even in difficult times. So we've had a technical textile company manufacturing outdoor athletic equipment shifted to mask making, and a company that was in the meal kit delivery service, meal kit preparation and delivery in the workplace, shifted to Uber or ride sharing kind of platforms to get food to people. The company I mentioned earlier in transportation became more expansion focused to try and remedy the fraud in Medicare and Medicaid dedicated to transportation. So we've been excited to see these innovative people take the lead and create opportunity where there was none, or where they couldn't have seen it even in February. In general, what we're looking for now is companies that not only have those exceptional management teams, but are able to scenario plan. You have to be very flexible right now. It's more about figuring out what might happen than a linear line of projections that you can make to your business. So it's a lot of thinking about if this, then what. And we've been able to work with a tremendous number of people that are very, I'm just extremely proud of and extremely excited about. I really have a lot of confidence in our rural communities and their leadership. So I think that's a good summary. If there's a little bit of extra time here, but I look forward to the Q&A.
Great, thank you, Chris, and thank you to all of our speakers. This is where if we were meeting in person, I would ask for a round of applause, but I will just offer that virtually for thanking you for sharing your expertise and perspectives. I'm going to start off with a question from the chat and ask it from all three of you. How can we build greater systems capacity to receive and use capital in rural areas of Pennsylvania? How can we include more low-income residents, including women, and serving agencies in the process? Anyone feel free to jump in.
think if the questions around expanding the diversity and those types of efforts in rural communities, it is true that we find more homogeneity in rural towns and rural communities. But I would say that with COVID, and I didn't mention this, there was already a little bit of a trend of people moving to quality lifestyle. When you have broadband, you can work and live anywhere. To Ted's earlier point, place, people, these things are enriching. And we'd already seen some trends moving in those ways, and we're starting to see more of that. So as that happens, naturally, you'll be able to expand to more of those populations. But it is difficult, I have to say, for us to find investments. I mentioned the company that does some disability hiring. You know, it's all through the companies that we're involved in and their initiatives that we get involved. We do seek them out. We seek them out in our fund in terms of hiring and then in the teams that we invest in.
Yeah, and I will add on to what Chris said. From Benedum's perspective, I think we have seen just a lot of creativity come out of women-led businesses and nonprofits and minority-led initiatives. I'll give you an example. In the public health space in West Virginia, we have been involved in and a supporter of the growth of federally qualified healthcare centers. West Virginia is one of the states that is majority Medicare, Medicaid. It's a really important issue for people of poverty to get access to healthcare. And we have seen great leadership out of the Partnership for African American Churches in West Virginia. And that's just one example where even into the public health space of how do we better serve minority and other harder to reach communities has been creative ideas have come out of the last couple months with COVID. We've also seen this with many of our women-led nonprofits that have been much more aggressive, assertive, proactive. They're just killing it with trying to figure out how to bring in more federal dollars. And these intermediaries really benefit the whole state in many cases. And I could say the same for the arts community. Lots of creativity, and many of this is happening with women-led nonprofits that are serving the arts communities that are trying to really figure out how to shore up and provide more support to artists in rural communities.
Just one quick comment. I think part of the challenge is recognizing that the issue isn't just a lack of access to capital, that there are capacity challenges out there. And I think that foundations that are willing to put investment dollars into a community development financial institution, for example, without also putting grant dollars in so that they can provide the technical assistance needed to make sure that those companies can actually access and use the capital. You know, the work that Chris is doing is part of the recognition that has to happen, that this is a capacity and capital challenge, not just one.
Great, thank you. And on that note of both the capacity and capital challenge, I wanted to thank all of you for giving illustrative examples of partnerships in your presentations, and just ask if there are replicable models that exist for place-based and regional partnerships that you would highlight, particularly thinking about involving both capacity and capital building.
Well, I think it's important to at least mention this is an emerging model in Appalachia, Invest Appalachia, which is a fund that is designed to bring resources into the region, not just investment dollars, but also capacity building dollars. It's new and young, built on a lot of good, to Jen's point, a lot of good shared analysis of what's going on in the region and long foundation of relationships among the partners that sort of gave birth to Invest Appalachia. But I think it is something to watch for the region because it is a pretty unique model that again is very intentional about recognizing it's about investment dollars and capacity building dollars. And then the other thing I would say is there's, like in many crises, there's an amazing amount of innovation out there. I mean, I can't believe the number of funds we see coming across just the email trail that had been created to address very specific needs coming out of the crisis. And I think many of those are collaborative models, and I think we just need to be able to watch. And maybe it's a role that the feds can play in helping us really track what the impact of some of these is over time.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that. These are such exciting innovations coming out of rural communities. Invest Appalachia, Benedum will be an early funder, and it is a really, really interesting way to push the envelope on how do we bring more capital into an underserved and lesser resourced region. One of the dilemmas we have in rural places is getting the attention of the national foundations that have the billions of dollars in their own assets. This is the Gates, the Forbes, the Kresge's, all of these national foundations who want to see their money go equitably into under-resourced places, but don't necessarily know the partnerships. Back to the 4 really important words that came out of Teresa Singleton's presentation earlier. It's just so important that there's partnerships that can bring that money down. Deb's been involved, we've been involved in seeing the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation use our relationships to better understand rural health investment and capacity building. They're involved in another initiative that Deb's been heavily involved in. Same thing happened with the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation. From the Pacific Northwest, how do you understand how to invest in Appalachia or these rural communities? You want to, you know it's the right equity model, but how do you really do that? The people place partnerships so they can affect policy. And these are really essential. And what we've learned through the Appalachian Funders Network is that we can push the envelope on these new innovations so that national dollars can go into new platforms, and then we can start to stack capital in new ways so that gets down into rural communities. So that only happens if there's a kind of a network to build capacity and make that work. But I am more optimistic than ever, and it's a great opportunity for foundations to hear about these innovations and use our startup money, our patient capital, our capital that can be more higher risk to get some of these initiatives off the ground. A third example is the Appalachian Community Capital, which is also serving a big region that flows money down into CDFIs as well. Great idea, and these have all been innovations that have built new capital sources and aggregation of capital to go into under-resourced communities and projects.
Yeah, and I'll just add the private lens. So we see, from the company standpoint, we're looking at a business now that was funded originally from a CDFI and also a Telluride-based venture fund. It's actually in our region and not in Telluride. So they came this way and found great people doing an interesting having an interesting business. So the funding sources were also very local in terms of the individual people that started it. There were friends and family, and it started in 2014. It's now $7.5 million in revenues, and we can get involved. So we can see people from all over the country investing in really creative ways in great companies with great ideas, and that's the private part of the economy. Not as much, everything's necessary, but it's just a different lens.
Great, thank you. And it looks like we've got time for one more question, so I will pull a good one from the chat. Can any of you speak to the education challenges, specifically how we work with micro businesses that are most of rural PA to help them think strategically about funding?
Can you expand on that, how the education works with the with the funding piece?
Steve, would you want to unmute yourself and expand there?
Sure. And
Great.
I think Nathaniel sees what's coming. I love the conversation about providing funding. my heart is with micro businesses, so we don't hit that $5 million threshold. But as we look at micro businesses and so forth, we can give them funding, but it's all too easy for business owners to fall into the trap of using it for operations and not transforming their business into something else or focusing on business. Is there any sort of educational program that ties in with that, or do you all have references to programs that come alongside and help them take advantage of that funding that they receive?
From Bennett, our most successful partner in achieving what you're speaking about is to invest in CDFIs who then invest in the businesses. So we have a lot of history in the past 20 years of sort of dumping a pot of money into a CDFI who is illustrated for us in a grant application or in a PRI type scenario, that they want to serve businesses in a way that helps, you know, businesses with 5 employees or less, helps them really get their business models and the technical assistance that they need to become a growing business, and that they can then and ultimately become bankable to sort of traditional financing. And so for us, every time we put money into a CDFI, it looks a little bit different because they're trying to achieve something different with a subset of businesses or a subset of projects. Sometimes they're real estate projects. But in your case, like, this is where we would want to find a CDFI partner and have you talk to them about how you partner with that CDFI potentially to create a program that you can best advise on that. How do we really help X number of Pennsylvania micro businesses achieve what you want with an investment partner? Because, you know, from a foundation's IRS sort of requirements and the like, we can't do that individually, but we can best do it through a CDFI that is also achieving economic development outcomes with those businesses. So if was that clear enough, or do you want to build on it? And then others, Chris and Locust probably has some good experience doing this as well.
I was just going to mention, there are a couple of, and they fall into the CDFIs that have a real micro focus. Mountain BizWorks, which works in Western North Carolina, so the Appalachian part of North Carolina, and an organization called ACE in Georgia. It started in North Georgia with a real micro focus. Both of those organizations had a real commitment, and in the early years of Mountain BizWorks, at least, you needed to go through an education program and training program before you had access to micro capital. And so the capital was a bit of a carrot to actually help the business really think about how they were going to use that capital and to deploy it well. And so I think trying to find a few of those CDFIs that have created and often have done it with support from foundations to build the capacity in their training programs. Another one is Northern Initiatives up in the UP of Michigan that has done some really interesting blended learning between videos and coaching. But again, it is so critical because you're not, I've heard it described as a risk mitigation strategy by Ines Polonius, who runs an organization called Communities Unlimited. That has an entrepreneurship effort with a lot of training, and they work in some of the poorest, hardest hit rural counties in the Arkansas and Mississippi Delta. So I think those are, looking for those kinds of models is probably, to Jen's point, a good match with those CDFIs.
And I guess I would just add that it is the hardest, it's the biggest challenge we face is education, because once we find a company and usually it has to be through trusted sources. I mean, people don't trust private equity, honestly. It has a negative, they have negative connotations around it. So it's really hard to break through those preconceived notions about what we can add and how we can add value. So typically we end up having to spend a lot of time on education. Part of what we're doing today is education and an evangelical work. So it's really speaking a lot, getting into specific communities. We find service providers, attorneys, and accountants are often good at helping owners and operators and business entrepreneurs understand what the market is, because they may not understand that what we're offering is what the market is market terms. So they have to have a lot of confidence. So we end up building a lot of trust along the way. We're investing in a company next month that we met 14 months ago. And we've been sort of courting and getting to know each other all along, and followed them through COVID, helped with PPP, helped in identifying a chief financial officer, helped into marketing strategy, all of this work before we put any money in. So we're kind of out there with you wanting to spread the news, and we feel education is part of our mission, actually. So I don't know that we're an ecosystem, but we're just out there doing it.
Great, thank you. And thank you again, Deb, Jen, and Chris, for sharing your perspectives and expertise with us, and for encouraging us to think comprehensively, both in terms of partnerships and networks, and also in terms of capital and capacity building. So there's a lot to think about and discuss as we move into the breakout discussions. So with that, I will turn it back over to Nathan.
Thank you, Ali, and thanks also to the panelists. We are going to switch now to the small group breakout discussions. Good morning, everyone. Thanks again for joining us today. I'm looking forward to hearing how the breakout conversations went, and I am going to turn things off to the moderator and first speaker for our resource chat on place-based and regional capital investment strategies. Jennifer Wakeman is the executive director for Drive Economic Development Entity. I'd like to remind everyone, if you could keep your cameras on, but keep your microphones muted if you're not asking a question or speaking. And you can also submit questions in the chat. And please, if you just joined us or if you had to rejoin, please enter your name and organization in the Zoom name feature so that folks can see who you are and what organization you're with. With that, Jen, thank you so much.
Thanks, Nathaniel. I appreciate the invitation to be here today, and I'm really pleased to be joined on this panel. I don't know how I scored like 2 deputy secretaries, but that seems kind of cool to me. Rick Valello and Cheryl Cook. I feel like kind of like the also ran on this squad right now, but that's okay. So we're looking forward to, and we kind of all got together over the phone a couple of days ago to sort of talk through some of the things that we want to bring to the table for discussion today. Around, you know, what are the resources? We've talked a lot about partnerships, and that's certainly a part of this discussion. And so just to give you kind of a short history of who Drive is, for those of you who may not know, although a bunch of my colleagues from the region are here, so hi to all of you. But Drive is an economic development council of governments that serves 5 counties in the central Susquehanna region. They include Columbia, Montour, Northumberland, Snyder, and Union counties. Our 2 founding counties, which were Columbia and Montour, came together in 2015 with the realization that economic development is a regional activity. It does not follow county lines, and they really felt like having dedicated staff doing the work that was necessary to create a real impact was going to be important. Also, looking for ways to have kind of efficiency of delivery of economic development and all of the things that tie in with that. So really, we are kind of the boots on the ground when it comes to site selection for either expansion of current industries that are already here in the region, as well as working on bringing new capital investment into the region. So we have a number of partnerships that we work with to market the region, provide technical assistance to current businesses, business development, access to capital, workforce, community development. All of those things are kind of pieces to that puzzle of economic development. And really at Drive, our main role is to sort of put all those pieces together. Like how do these resources benefit a company, and what is it that they're needing to be successful? Because ultimately, you know, that's kind of what economic development is. And a lot of our partners are here today. Like I mentioned, I'm really glad to have them here to be part of the conversation. Specifically related to COVID, because how can you have a conversation about economic development and not talk about COVID-19? I want to hit a couple of the highlights. This is by no means an exhaustive summary of what we have seen in the region, but just some of them. With most economic cycles, what tends to happen in our region is things hit us late. We were late to the party on the 2008 crash. It hit us in 2009. And I know Rick's going to talk more about that. He can put meat on the bones for us around some of those things. But the impact of COVID-19 on our region, we certainly saw the immediate downturn related to service sector. Obviously, that was pretty straightforward. But compared to the more urban areas, I don't think we saw it as quickly. First, it took a while for COVID to even get here. And then, of course, there were the economic impacts from shutdowns and things like that were mandated by the governor. But there were certainly instances of businesses who were being forced to shut down for nearly 2 months over the spring. And now we're seeing the ramifications of that. We have plant closings, like complete total shutdown, never coming back. We now are also seeing layoffs that are related to downturns in other markets. So companies that are here, they're in a supply chain. That supply chain is in an industry, say like aeronautics is a good example, that there's just, they've seen a downturn. They're not predicting that business is coming back for 2 to 3 years. So now we're seeing layoffs related to that. As with everywhere else in the state, we've certainly seen pain on Main Street with the restrictions put on restaurants and other gathering places. In my breakout group, we were talking, there was someone from Pocono region, and certainly the loss of the tourism business and what that did with hotel, restaurant. Again, it's place-based, it's what draws people, but when they can't come or they can't gather, you know, that's had a significant impact. In our region, we are very blessed to have strong downtown organizations, and they have done a lot of incredible work to help our local small businesses, the mom and pops, the things that are that you find when you go through your downtowns. They've done amazing work to help those businesses survive the pandemic as well as they could. We were also saying and I said this in my breakout session, really our downtowns, and when you talk about partnerships, our downtown organizations and Drive are kind of two sides of the same coin. I can't do well without them doing well, and they don't do well without our organization doing well. Because in order for me to attract new business or to keep companies that are here happy and able to attract talent, we need to have great places for them to come to. And our downtowns are kind of key to that. And so, you know, I need them to create great downtowns and they need me to create great jobs. So it's sort of like two sides of the same coin. On the positive side of COVID, because there have been some really positive stories that have come out of it, we have several companies in the region that have experienced extreme growth during the pandemic, which seems really unlikely, but there are a couple of things that I've been able to sort of pull out in talking with them about why have they been able to succeed. And primarily, they're companies that were already conducting all or a significant amount of their business online prior to COVID. Additionally, they are producing consumable products like spices and coffee and tea and things like that, that as the market shifted and people stayed home, they cooked more at home, they didn't go to a coffee shop. So those companies were able to adapt and meet those new demands. For example, I have a spice company that they said their restaurant business, so their huge giant bulk orders tanked in April, May, June. But their private label business, which is what goes to grocery stores, bodegas, things like that, went up. And then their online ordering for kind of what you and I would buy to have in our house went through the roof. They've added new staff. They are flush with cash. They're trying to find a new location to just dump money into it so that when they're ready to grow on the other side of this, that they can do that. So there are those positive stories. It's just, you know, how do we how do we learn from their experience, not just, how do we learn from the companies that are not doing well, but also how do we learn from the ones that are? So the success in the online sales of those companies kind of transitions nicely into one of Drive's key projects that we've been involved with over the last couple of years. And we've already touched on this topic today in the earlier session. We developed a fixed-base wireless broadband network in Montour County. It went online in May of 2019. Geisinger, who is one of our major employers and also just a really, healthcare powerhouse in the region and across the state, played a key role in the development of that project. They provided $300,000 in the form of a forgivable loan to fund that pilot project. And we knew, and if you're not familiar with Montour County, it is geographically the smallest county in the state. So it is like the perfect place to run a pilot project for fixed base wireless because we don't have a lot of ground to cover. So we learned a lot from that process. And we built a carrier grade community network that is designed to carry mission critical data for public safety, municipal government, industry, all while also being able to serve small business and residential customers. Drive and its member counties own the equipment on the network, but we then contract out with private internet service providers to provide that service to the end user. So we don't really have customers per se, other than like Montour County, because they actually use the network. They have four buildings that are county offices. They were being run on about 25 different individual cable modems, and now they are on a single wide area network. I mean, they were running an entire county on 10 and 1, which, if you know what that means, it's 10 megabits per second down and 1 up. So like really slow. Industry standard is now to be called broadband is 25 and 3. So just for reference. But they ran a whole county on it and they did a great job, but now they have a wide area network. So it was sort of this was all their idea, quite frankly. I was not looking to build a broadband network. It just sort of happened. I was either in the right place or the wrong place at the right time, depending on how you want to look at it. So we've had this network. We have 2 ISPs that are running on it right now. And then COVID-19 hit. And the one thing that certainly did was shine a very bright light on the need for broadband in rural America. We've said for years that high-speed internet is a piece of required infrastructure, just like sewer and water and electricity and all those other things. And now I think that need has been magnified to a point that it's getting not just the attention of those of us who live in rural America. And we were very fortunate, thanks to CARES Act legislation. Our 5 counties now have engaged in an expansion of that initial pilot network into 4 additional counties, and also reaching a little more into Montour that we hadn't gotten to before. So by the end of this year, we will have invested $3.2 million of CARES Act funding across the 5 counties to build out a network that will allow those ISPs to get to some of these very unserved regions. So we're really trying to bridge that digital divide in rural Pennsylvania for telework, telemedicine, teleeducation, all of those things that really we have always needed and now we absolutely need. And to just touch on the partnership thing a little bit more, we've worked with our intermediate unit as well as our United Way to figure out, which school districts need service the most. And then they all had data, which was amazing. Data is so hard to come by sometimes for some of these things beyond anecdotal. Our school districts had information that they had collected from early on in the pandemic in March. Where are their students and who has service, who doesn't have service. And we can get that to a very hyper-local level thanks to some of the research and work that had been done early on by those other public partners. So that was really beneficial to us as we design this network and build it out. All that said, wireless broadband is not by any stretch of the imagination the only solution to the problem. This need for rural broadband has been likened to the rural electrification that was done back in the early part of the 20th century. And it's going to take all of us, public partners, government entities, private enterprise, all working together through a multitude of new technologies to really bring broadband internet to every home, every business in the Commonwealth. And I do not claim to know it all. I think there are a ton of different ways that this can be done. There are a lot of opportunities, and I think finding those key partnerships, again, you know, we would not have done this if Geisinger hadn't come to the table. And just for the record, we didn't spend the full $300,000 either, but that's how much they earmarked for us. But we would not have been able to do this without them saying, this is something we can get behind. And they had no idea what was coming down the pike in the land of telemedicine. So I won't belabor that point. There's certainly, I'm happy to, you know, answer questions when we get to it. But as we transition from me talking about what Drive has been up to and kind of like the, you know, how do those partnerships play into economic development? I'm going to hand it over to Rick here in a second, but really economic development happens when somebody puts capital at risk. And a lot of what we do here at Drive is to help mitigate that risk for companies. But ultimately, it's having access to that capital that drives that engine of economic development. And so I really appreciate the session that we had earlier from those funding partners to talk about new and kind of unique ways to think about generating the capital that is needed to continue to grow in a pandemic or not. Although I think that's kind of the new thing right now. It's going to be pandemic growth for the time being. This is the reality that we're all living in. So I will be glad to take questions. Please remember to put them in the chat. But to really kind of put some meat on the bones of, you know, with numbers and some more discussion on the role that capital plays, I'm going to hand it over to Rick Valello, who is a Deputy Secretary from the Department of Community and Economic Development. Take it away, Rick.
Well, Jennifer, thank you. You did an awesome job. I could just do my presentation and say yes, what Jennifer said, and move on. So great job. I put my contact information in the chat at the beginning. I included my cell phone. It goes back many, many years to when I first started as mayor of Lock Haven. The networking is important. One of the things I'll build on, and being a Commonwealth with 2,560 municipalities, the things that are affecting the city of Philadelphia are going to affect, you know, East Buffalo Township differently than, you know, just because of population, access, all of the things that Jennifer was talking about. But, you know, the strategies and the important parts can be used all over Pennsylvania. You know, it is not any one thing. Everything affects everything else. And, you know, the best advice I can give to people today, you know, post-COVID, is the advice I would give pre-COVID is, you know, do you know your township supervisors by name? Do you know your borough council people and mayor? Do you know your city council people and mayor by name? Do you know your county commissioners by name? And do they know your name? You know, do they know you to say hello when you're not knocking on their door asking for something? You know, going to the next level, do you know your state rep and state senator by name? Do you know your congressperson? Do you know your US senator? And, you know, when you talk about programs, and, you know, with Cheryl on, and, you know, Meredith with DCNR, you know, we work closely together. And maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you could go to one place and get the funding all in one place for a project. Those days don't exist anymore. You know, I have a book in my desk that has all of the DCD funding programs. There's 92 different separate standalone programs that DCD funds. About 20 of them are active. About 70 of them have no funding and open at different times. So, some local elected officials, some nonprofits, look at the funding sources and try to develop a project around specific funding sources. I guarantee you those projects aren't going to be strong and their support isn't going to be strong. You need to identify the needs in a community, figure out, what you need to do right now and figure out what you need to do 5 years from now, figure out how you're going to accomplish it, and then work with your partners, not just your elected officials, your DCD regional person, your local government policy specialist from DCD, do you know who works for USDA in your region, what board members do you know, and can you put that team together to support a project? And Philadelphia and the larger urban areas are fortunate that most of the positions are held by paid employees. You have planners, you have community development people, you have specific people that's their full-time job. In rural Pennsylvania, most positions are filled by volunteers and part-time people. Does it mean they're any less skilled? Does it mean they have less resources? I don't know the answer to that, but how can you, in rural Pennsylvania, and several people serve on multiple boards and in multiple positions. So how can we use that in rural Pennsylvania as a strength? How can we use the people who are serving on multiple boards as leverage to get support for projects? One of the things that we've seen with the pandemic and having to work remotely and do Zoom meetings is, some of the people that are paying $2,000 a month for an apartment in Philadelphia now realize that they don't have to live in Philadelphia in 600 square feet. They could live in Wayne County or Pike County near a trail where the quality of life is a lot better and work remotely. How are we going to leverage that in rural Pennsylvania to strengthen our communities, to make it more attractive to people? How are we going to make, the strengths of rural Pennsylvania, the quality of life, the access to recreation, the access to where people want to live, to come out of the pandemic stronger? Leadership is a challenge. Many places have had the same leadership for decades, multiple decades. And has the pandemic brought light to a weakness in local leadership? How are we going to encourage people to get involved locally? It's a critical time, and it's a time when politics has invaded all of our lives. Well, how can we use those frustrations to encourage strong local leadership and a transition to a new economy? What's that transition going to look like? We're talking about another wave, and that we're more prepared for another wave. But is that new wave going to present leadership challenges? our friends, our neighbors are getting frustrated by, what we're facing on a day-to-day basis. How, what are we going to look like in 6 months? It was hard enough before the pandemic to predict what next year looked like, let alone 5 years from now. But, every strategic plan is important to lay that roadmap out. And it's important to be flexible on that roadmap moving forward. Cheryl and I have known each other for over 20 years, and it was the relationship between, because we were both appointed to a statewide board about the same time, the Governor's Advisory Council on Rural Affairs. Some of the discussions from 20 years ago are still discussions that are happening every day. The importance of broadband, the importance of water resources, conservation, farmland preservation. All of those are discussions that are happening every day, and more important now more than ever. What we're seeing in what Jennifer talked about is COVID hasn't affected rural Pennsylvania as much or as quickly as it affected urban areas. It doesn't mean that will not come. When you look at the delay in real estate tax revenue, most of the tax bills were already distributed by the time March came. Many people planned on paying them during the discount period. So most places haven't seen much of an impact in the real estate revenue. Real estate revenue makes up the largest share of local government revenue. Earned income taxes, some, amusement taxes, some, parking revenue, some, but, the bulk of rural revenue is from real estate taxes. So, as people lose jobs in 2020 going into 2021, will we see a bigger impact on real estate taxes? Will we see a larger percentage going to sheriff's sale and judicial sale? How are our local governments budgeting? How will that budgeting affect, our nonprofits, our main streets? How can we make up for that income? Are the relationships with the foundation strong? Are they looking at, the county foundations, the community foundations, the statewide and national foundations? All of that goes into our decision making, and how can we, on a local level, make a difference and make the places we live better places to live. Don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'll turn it over to Cheryl, and I'll look forward to questions at the end.
Yeah, you make a great point, Rick, about the new economy and what that's going to look like. And I think it's a great transition into what Cheryl's going to talk about, because when you talk about rural Pennsylvania, a lot of our economy is agricultural. And broadband plays a huge role in the agricultural industry and the ability for those businesses to grow and thrive where they need to be, which is in rural America. So I think it's kind of it's a great transition though, right into the things that Cheryl wants to talk about, because what you do at DCED and what she is doing at Department of Ag, they are again so tied together. Great that you all have had that relationship together for 20 years of in your professional life, because it's important to have state folks talking to one another and working across boundary lines. So Cheryl, I'm not going to steal your thunder. Go for it.
Okay. Well, there's so many things Cheryl wants to talk about. I'm looking forward to figuring out what I'm actually going to say in the next few minutes. It is good to see so many old friends. You know how it is. Everywhere you go, you bring your past lives with you. So I'm bringing today 14 years at USDA, most of that in rural development, and 11 years now, believe it or not, with the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. And most of that time in one sphere or the other has been spent trying to help rural people understand the importance of agriculture still to the rural economy, while helping farmers understand that they actually need those neighbors around them, and recognizing, celebrating, building on the many direct farmer to consumer relationships that we have in Pennsylvania. We are actually #1 in the United States for direct sales from farmers to consumers. It's kind of the silver lining of all that farmland being turned into housing developments. So I want to focus on, agriculture matters as part of our long-term strategic planning, as part of our how do we get over COVID. One of the few constants this year is that crops went in the ground in the spring and they're being harvested right now in the fall. And as those crops get turned into livestock feed or into other value-added products, it's creating jobs, it's creating opportunities, creating new wealth. And of all of the types of manufacture that there are under this sun, agriculture remains the only area that's producing something capable of reproducing itself. Whether it's the next litter of piglets, whether it's the seed that you get for next year's crop as you harvest this fall. With all due respect to all of the advances in artificial intelligence, there is still something very, very special about production agriculture and what it means to a new wealth economy. Particularly important in Pennsylvania that we now have, as of last week, let me get these numbers right, 5,781 farms that are preserved forevermore in perpetuity in production agriculture under our farmland preservation program, representing 589,109 acres of Pennsylvania. So that's more than 10% of our farms. It's not quite 10% of the farmland, but we'll get there. The important thing is to understand that communities all over Pennsylvania have made that commitment to production agriculture by creating agricultural security areas, by enrolling land in farmland preservation, and by investing in agriculture in a way that I think will continue for many years. I hope it will. At the same time, though, we're facing a workforce shortage in agriculture. We have 2 farmers, over the age of 65 for everyone who's under the age of 30. And that's something that hasn't changed in the last 20 years. We've been gradually losing that next generation that can see more economic opportunity going into some other aspect of food production or going out of agriculture altogether. Recruiting new people into agriculture is one of those areas that I focus on a lot now, in part because of the workforce issue, in part because of equity issues. We have an awful lot of people who've moved into Philadelphia, who've emigrated from back home, wherever they were, probably on the land, probably engaged in agriculture, who'd like nothing better than to get involved in agriculture again, who are living in areas that are food deserts, who are living in places where they don't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, and who would like nothing better than a chance to buy some farmland. There are a few things the General Assembly has done in the last year that are worth noting in this regard. One is already with preserved farms, there was an exemption from the real estate transfer tax if you were transferring a farm within the family. That has now been extended to apply to any beginning farmer buying a preserved farm. They don't have to pay the real estate transfer tax. There also are some new tax credits that our colleagues at DCED have helped to stand up, that beginning in January for sales that took place this year or long-term leases that took place this year. Some incentives in the form of tax credits to get existing farmers to work with new and beginning farmers, especially if they don't have children in their own family who are looking to take over. So agriculture matters. It's an essential part of Pennsylvania's economy, has been since the days of William Penn, and will be for decades to come. Secondly, partnerships do matter. As Rick mentioned and others have, state agencies are cooperating together in a way that we hadn't before. Yes, 20 years ago, we were talking about the need for broadband, but at the time we were lamenting that people who lived in rural areas didn't know what they were missing. And I can remember working with the Center for Rural Pennsylvania on a survey of asking people, what are your priorities for your rural community? And it was things like access to education and access to healthcare and access to market opportunities and things that people just weren't making the connection. If you had the broadband, you could go get all that other stuff. It would come of its own accord. I think if people didn't already realize that, with streaming services taking over how we entertain ourselves, certainly the COVID-19 virus has brought that. Apologies for the cat fight. Knock it off. They've been sleeping all morning. I knew the moment I started to talk, they would all wake up, and that would be the end of that. Anyway, broadband remains something that we're working on. Even before COVID, we had the Restore PA initiative, trying to help rural communities understand they could be at the front of the line for broadband deployment. But even more so now with COVID, we've found that our partnerships matter with other state agencies, whether it's DCED helping us with the list of who is essential, and all ag businesses were deemed essential to operate during COVID, partnering with the Department of Health to make sure that there were testing facilities reasonably near to meatpacking plants, so that as employees showed up for work, they could get tested and make sure that we didn't have in Pennsylvania some of the situations we've heard about on the news in other states. Partnering with Health even now that they have a mobile testing unit, that it got to Chester County and was available to the mushroom community and some of the folks working in that area. Partnerships with really all of state agencies, and Pennsylvania government is united against COVID-19. Third point, I think, is that equity matters, and Pennsylvania has a ways to go in this. What we've seen in the last several ag censuses, and for those of you who don't know, one of the other branches of USDA, the National Ag Statistics Service, is charged with doing a census of agriculture every 5 years. Most recently, that was in 2017. What we're seeing is that there is an increasing presence of particularly Latino population in rural communities, engaged not just in the seasonal and migrant activities that we're used to in our fruit belt, but actually taking on day-to-day management of dairy operations, engaged heavily in the dairy industry, but having very little opportunity to get started in agriculture and take on their own farms. So working on equity and how do we make sure that those opportunities that exist are available to everyone is one of those areas where I think you will see state government continue to move in concert, and as well between state and federal government. I think the last point I want to make, just on behalf of my prior 2 lives in rural development, USDA is a wonderful resource, and Pennsylvania does a great job of taking advantage of rural housing loans and rural water and waste disposal loans from USDA. When I served as Deputy Undersecretary of Rural Development in the first few years of the Obama administration, we were informed that had we been a private bank, we would have been the 7th largest lender in the United States. But the fact is, when you look outside of New York and California and Texas and start looking at Mississippi and Arkansas and other more predominantly rural states, rural development is almost the largest lender in every case. And there are opportunities where even Pennsylvania could do more work with rural development. It's good to see David Cayley on the call today. David and I go back 150 years to when the Progress Fund was first forming, and the intermediary relending program was helpful to him. I think he would say. Others of you I know I've encountered in my prior lives at USDA. They've actually got 4 different programs that will capitalize a revolving loan fund, including one that requires working with your local rural electric cooperative, and we're lucky to have 12 of those operating between Pennsylvania and southern New Jersey that I'm sure we'll hear more about later today. But the opportunities for partnership are many. I will follow Rick's lead and put my cell phone number in the chat. But why don't I stop there, and we can turn it over to the Q&A, more interesting portion of the session.
Thanks, Cheryl. I appreciate your thoughts on the importance of agriculture to the economy, to the state, to the Commonwealth. My very first job after graduating from college and moving back to Pennsylvania was actually working in agriculture. And I grew up in Pittsburgh and I knew exactly nothing about agriculture when I took that job. So it's one of those
local
things.
Foods progress around Pittsburgh has just been outstanding. The amount of awareness that has grown around the importance of having locally produced food has really been rewarding to see.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the advantages of living in rural Pennsylvania. You know, I think sometimes we take it for granted that, you know, like, doesn't everybody have a farmer's market? And it was grown by those people that I know who live down the street. So, you know, it's certainly becoming a more well understood issue, I think, than I mentioned Geisinger earlier, and I'll plug one of their programs that they've been working on here in the region. Is they've developed a fresh food pharmacy, and it's actually working with people to improve their access to high quality food, and helping them change their diet, but also teaching them how to use it and how to get it and where to get it and giving them access to it, because it's still, even here in some areas, it's difficult to find. So kudos for the folks doing those kinds of programs. I want to get to a couple of questions here before we Nathaniel comes in and like hooks us with the big giant crook. But one of the questions I think that's come up in discussion is, you know, what are the resources? We talked a little bit about capacity and capital to deploy, or capacity to deploy capital, but Rick and Cheryl, what are some of the resources that are available? And I think you mentioned, Cheryl, USDA is a great one to bolster access to capital in the wake of COVID-19. I think we've heard some of that from, you know, the kind of from the first panel, you know, their sort of look at it, but from a more, you know, in the land that you guys work in, what do you see as those places where, you know, capital can be accessed by small and large businesses alike here in the rural parts of the Commonwealth?
I'll go first. Knowing which programs and what programs open when and how they fit with your projects is really, really important. And one of the things that I brag about over the course of my 20 years as mayor is in Lock Haven, we brought in $66 million in grants in a 20-year period that were state and federal programs, USDA, Penvest, other sources. But, you know, knowing when programs open and having those relationships is really, really important. And 20 years ago, you could go to DCD and get one grant to do a whole project. Those days don't exist anymore. So, you know, the relationships with DCD, with DCNR, with DEP, with the Department of Ag, you know, you can have Department of Ag, DCNR, DEP, and DCD all funding parts of a stormwater project or a park project, or, you know, when you look at the infrastructure, you have Small Soil and Water funding parts of a project with Penvest. You have DEP funding parts of sewer and water projects with Penvest. And knowing how to put those jigsaw puzzles together is really, really important. And bringing your state partners into a project, the earlier the better. You know, if you have something already completed and you're not willing to change how you're looking at a project, you know, could affect the ability of state agencies and federal agencies to fund it. But if it's early on and, you know, you're working with those partners and they say, well, have you considered doing this to absorb more runoff? Or have you looked at, you know, connecting with this trail so that it's more walkable, and being able to put that jigsaw puzzle together for funding sources is really, really important.
Yeah, I would probably echo what Rick said. I would look too to loan guarantees, and it's an underutilized part of USDA. Again, the really nice thing about the loan guarantee is that the guaranteed portion of the loan won't count against the bank's loan loss reserve, so you're free to keep relending and relending and relending. One of the nice things USDA just did, just so you don't think I'm only bragging on them while I worked for them, is they recently managed to merge several of their processes for applications for lenders. So a lender now approved for the Business and Industry Loan Guarantee Program also is approved for the Water and Waste Disposal Program, the Community Facilities Program, and the Rural Energy for America Program. So with one application, a lender now has a lot more access into guarantee possibilities from USDA. I would look too, though, the community foundations have done such a nice job in getting people to invest in themselves, but I'm mindful forevermore of the Nebraska Community Foundation model. It's a statewide community foundation. What they were doing when they were getting started was trying to convince rural Nebraskans to treat their community like their last child, so that as they mapped out the loss of wealth, as intergenerational wealth transfers were taking place with children long gone from rural Nebraska, the land was still there, but the value had all transferred to Lincoln or to Chicago or to other urban areas. Convincing people that if you had two kids, give them each a third and give a third to the community was kind of a long shot, but 25 years later, they've amassed quite a nice nest egg to invest in rural areas and attract additional investments in rural areas in Nebraska.
All right. I think we are about at our time, so I will take a second just to thank Rick Valello and Cheryl Cook for your thoughts and your insights. They're always appreciated. It's always good to hear from the folks who are down in the trenches doing the work for the Commonwealth and the resources that really are available. Sometimes they're a little untapped or they're seemingly shrouded in mystery, but these are the people who can pull back the curtain and show you the way and how to make some of these things work. And they really are a fantastic resource. I know I rely on my state partners a lot in addition to my other local public partners. So thanks to you guys for being here. Thank you to the Federal Reserve for the invitation to be here. I certainly appreciated it. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Nathaniel.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I'll reiterate my thanks also to Cheryl and Rick. Excellent panel. I am going to hand things over to our speaker who's going to give closing remarks today. It is Matt Leonard, the Manager of State Government Affairs for the Pennsylvania Rural Electric Association. Matt, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Nathan, thank you. Thanks for the invite. I really appreciate being here. I've been told two important facts. One is I'm the last person to talk. Two is I only have 5 minutes, and I've never talked for just 5 minutes in my entire life. So I'm going to try and go quickly. All right. I'm going to focus just on rural broadband. I'm hoping that this group doesn't need to be told how important rural broadband is. I think I'm probably preaching to the choir there, but I do want to say, we hear all the time in our communities about how people want access to telemedicine, they want access to telework, they want access to distance learning. We want all of those things for our communities, particularly from an economic development standpoint. But as you know, without the broadband, none of that is, of course, going to happen. So I do, if you'll indulge me on a quick story, I do want to talk just a little bit about rural electrification and sort of how that parallels the kind of issues that we're seeing with rural broadband. In the early 1930s, 9 in 10 rural Americans did not have access to electricity. 90% of everyone in rural areas in our country did not have electricity. And as you can imagine, younger generations were moving away from their rural communities. There was no economic development really in those communities at that time. And it really was destroying communities here in Pennsylvania and throughout the country. It was completely unsustainable. So I won't go through the entire history of rural electrification, but I'll cut to the point, which is communities here, particularly in Pennsylvania, they worked with farmers, local businesses, they worked with the state government, particularly the federal government, to create programs to allow for the development of rural electric cooperatives who I represent. Some of the very first existed here in Pennsylvania. And today, over 50% of the entire country's landmass is covered by electric cooperative lines. And essentially, everyone in the nation has access to electricity. In the 1930s, that seemed like a real impossibility. It did not seem like something that we could possibly begin to accomplish. And really, I think today we take it for granted that everyone has access to electricity. And really, I think that cooperative model of partnering with their communities, partnering with the state government, partnering with the federal government is how we were able to accomplish that. And I hope that the parallels between rural electrification and what we're hoping to accomplish with broadband are pretty obvious. We really believe that without access to broadband, our rural communities are going to suffer. And the cooperatives look at themselves as really being community partners, community development organizations, and really just looking out for our members who are the community. So I do want to thank you for coming together to talk about these issues. We really believe that it's through groups like this where we're going to make progress. We do have some cooperatives who are already providing broadband to their members, broadband to the home, but electric cooperatives themselves can't accomplish this. It's really going to take something that takes everybody to get involved to make this happen. And again, just, relating it back to electrification, it really is possible. It's going to take time, but if we all work together, it really is something that we can accomplish. So again, thank you for the time. We are happy to work with anyone on broadband or any economic development issues. You should feel free to reach out to my organization, Pennsylvania Rural Electric Association. We cover about a third of the landmass of the entire state with our electric lines. So we're out there in those rural communities, and we want to be a source of economic development. I've gone over by 1 minute. I was close.
Thanks so much, Matt. And thank you to everyone who attended today, to all of the speakers, and to our co-hosts, the Center for Rural Pennsylvania and Penn State Center for Economic and Community Development. Our next assembly is scheduled for November 19th. It'll be on small business and place-based tourism. And we'll be issuing a survey to you all. There will be a link in the chat, and there will be a link in the follow-up email that you'll get. So please register for the next event, and please share your feedback. If you have any questions or concerns, you can reach out to me. My contact information is also in all the registration materials. I'll be glad to hear your thoughts. Thank you again for participating. Have a great afternoon.